corruption, racial tensions, and widespread poverty. For the Liberian people, this is only a small portion of the horrors that plague their day-to-day lives. Under the guidance of controversial President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, it is difficult to tell whether the future of the country will continue to improve or plunge further into darkness and madness. This issue raises one pertinent question. How did all these problems come to fruition? Looking back, Liberia's troubles appear to have begun with the arrival of African American slaves upon the West African coast in the early 19th century. However, to get the full picture, we must zoom even farther back, to just after the Revolutionary War fought in the United States to be precise. In 1791, Francois Dominique Toussaint Breda led a slave revolt against their masters in Santo Domingo. His motto, liberty, equality, fraternity, deeply disturbed American slave owners who were concerned their slaves would be inspired to hold uprisings against them. Racial harassment was prevalent, and the main force that prompted thousands of educated African Americans to immigrate to Liberia in the later years. An observation by Tyler McGraw stated that it was an American racism that drove literate and accomplished free blacks to Liberia. A ship full of voluntary immigrants was the first to arrive on the coast of Liberia in 1816. In the beginning, many people died from foreign diseases such as yellow fever and malaria. As the years went by, more and more African Americans sailed across the Atlantic Ocean in hopes of returning to their true home, where they can live in peace away from the confines of slavery and social injustice. These pursuits were aided by the American Colonization Society, ACS for short, an organization dedicated to supporting the migration of free blacks to Africa. ACS members had conflicting motives for their support. Some thought racial integration was impossible, while others, such as the Quakers, were adamantly against slavery. After President James Monroe sold land to the settlers, they finally had a true colony in Monrovia, the capital of Liberia. For a time, all was relatively peaceful in Liberia, that is, until the Americo-Liberian settlers seized control and declared themselves independent from the United States on July 26, 1847. They were first recognized by the British, followed by the Americans, nearly 2 decades later. Prior to this point in time, little is known about Liberian history. Archaeological evidence suggests that the area was occupied during the Sangoan period of the Stone Age, nearly 1 million years ago. There were 3 major ethnic groups: Niger-Congo-speaking peoples, Kruan-speaking peoples, and a third group of Mande-speaking peoples. Nearly all of Liberia was inhabited by indigenous peoples until the arrival of Western influences. Despite being the minority and having been exposed to oppression themselves in the past, the Americo-Liberians used the True Whig Party to abuse their power and manipulate the indigenous peoples. They had a strong sense of cultural supremacy, like Europeans, which had been instilled upon them during their time in America, and felt that it was their obligation to civilize the indigenous peoples in a twisted methodology similar to the white man's burden. Therefore, the corrupt and blatantly racist True Whig Party passed several laws that infringed upon human rights, such as denying native citizenship, including a mandatory dress code at public functions, and prohibiting merchants from selling their goods on Sundays and Christian holidays. This type of rule persisted for nearly 140 years. But how had they managed to retain control for so long? The answer is corruption, plain and simple. Similar to the American form of government, the political structure in Liberia has a separation of powers between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. As it so happened, executive branch officials will form alliances with local leaders who would assist them by maintaining power by block voting for them in elections. A ruler would cast votes on the behalf of everyone they president over who did not have the right to vote in the first place. This would result in almost comically ridiculous elections in which the votes outnumbered the amount of registered voters. Liberia had its fair share of both notoriously good and bad presidents, but for years, one aspect of their leadership remained the same. They were all members of the Americo-Liberian dominated True Whig Party. The party brought stability to Liberia at the expense of human rights violations. This new one-party government's 2 main goals were to A, modernize the country by improving in areas such as infrastructure and education, and B, to fix the many issues plaguing the economy, like extreme trade competition and unemployment. Rubber became the backbone of the economy and significantly increased the per capita income. President William Tubman, who served his term from 1944 to 1971, was able to successfully modernize much of the country and is credited with granting more rights to natives. Tensions rose once more when William Tolbert attempted to raise the price of rice, a staple food of Liberia as well as a major part of the economy. The results ended up with Tolbert being assassinated in 1980, marking the end of the True Whig Party's political domination after Samuel Doe, supported by the U.S., staged a political coup with the Liberian Army, AFL for short. which escalated into the country's first civil war in 1989. From 1985 to 1989, Charles Taylor not so secretly assembled a group of rebels in the Ivory Coast who were called the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, or NPFL for short. Prince Yormi Johnson branched off of the NPFL in order to create a separate force deemed by the Independent National Patriotic Front of Liberia, INPFL for short. On December 24, 1989, the NPFL invaded Nimba County, where the AFL troops counterattacked, killing civilians, burning villages in the process. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS for short, deployed military intervention forces in 1990 August to impose a ceasefire. Samuel Doe tried to visit the force's headquarters to negotiate, but he was captured by INPFL troops and brutally tortured to death on a live broadcast show of power. Several peace agreements were made over the course of the next 6 or so years, but violence continued to relapse, and human rights conditions were horrendous. Finally, in July 1997, the national elections were held under supervision of a wary United Nations Council. Charles Taylor and his National Patriotic Party won, marking the true end of Liberia's first civil war. Not even 2 full years later, the country erupted into a second civil war. In 1999, Sekou Gagne and his rebel group, the Liberians United for Reconciliation and Democracy, began an intense military offensive to usurp Charles Taylor from his presidency. Taylor managed to form a scraggly defense force, the Revolutionary United Front, RUF for short. A second group of rebels, the Movements for Democracy in Liberia, MODEL for short, joined in fighting against the RUF in 2003. ECOWAS, ECOWAS, sent Nigerian peacekeeping troops, and as the troops began to close in on him, Charles Taylor fled to exile in Nigeria on August 11, 2003. Like the first Civil War, the second ended with another ceasefire and an agreement for a transitional government. National elections were held in 2005, and Ellen Johnson Sirleaf became the 24th Liberian president and the first female president to head an African state. Now, over 200 years later, the country is still suffering from problems associated with the Americo-Liberian settlers. After the end of the First Republic in 1980, the political climate has been intensely turbulent. Dictator-like presidents would rule for a couple of years at a time, resulting in military coups and wars. Recently, President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf has been under enormous criticism. Popular opinion is that she has not done enough for her country, despite winning a Nobel Peace Prize in 2011 for her work in Liberia. At one point, there were as many as 20 different political parties registered for the October 2017 elections, all with conflicting ideas and stances on issues. Former rebel leader Prince Yormi Johnson is slated to be one of those candidates. Over a decade after the Civil War, the country is still unstable and the economy has yet to rebound. The Ebola outbreak has exacerbated many of Liberia's problems and made it exceedingly difficult to keep even minor issues in check. Multiple official and non-official political orders have been issued, such as limiting border crossings and confining exports to certain areas. President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf received even more criticism for attending the 4th Annual Euro-African Summit in Brussels, whilst the initial Ebola situation was unfolding. In response, the Unity Party derolled the politicalization of the Ebola crisis. The national public health emergency continued to worsen as the government continued to make empty promises without the intent to improve the situation that dragged on their feet. On July 26, 2014, an Ebola task force was finally established, but was largely unsuccessful due to organizational difficulties. The Liberia Ministry of Health and Social Welfare later implemented an incident management system, which developed methods to isolate cases, treat patients, and to an extent prevent transmission of the virus. Neighboring countries also had task forces of their own to tailor responses to the local needs and to collaborate to stop Ebola outbreak together. The world has since moved on from the conflict in Liberia. Since the Ebola virus has been for the most part contained, it is no longer considered a crisis nor a priority. But the truth is that Ebola is still a threat to the Liberian people, as flare-ups have occurred over the past few years. The current state of Liberia is far from where it should be. Corruption, racial tensions, and widespread poverty rack the country. From the beginning of the 19th century, these problems have festered and their roots lie between Americo-Liberian settlers and the indigenous peoples. What Liberia needs is change. A stable political system, love and acceptance, financial security. The country's future remains shrouded in mystery, giving rise to a dull apprehension that only time can cure. At best, the newly elected president in the October 2017 elections will be able to provide the reforms needed. At worst, things will continue the way they are for yet another 200 years.